Watching Vince's work in our department has been the quality of the research that his students are able to conduct, and it really has always said volumes for his abilities as a teacher and as a researcher himself. Among his recent publications that you will have run into are Vermont, An Illustrated History with John Duffy, and most recently, The Great Falls on Onion River, A History of Winooski, Vermont. He's also been president of the Chittenden County Historical Society and an active participant in historical projects in Winooski for a number of years as well. Tonight he's going to speak to us about his most recent research project, bringing together his two historically closest projects, the Irish and Vermont. So welcome, Vince.
Thank you, Joe. Now, is this thing on? Can everyone hear me clearly? Great. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening. And I also want to say it's so wonderful to see so many friends here that I haven't seen for a while. So many friends who have actually helped me in my research. As many of you know, the Hourigans and Anne Rowley Hourigan from the Fairfield area have been very instrumental in giving me information, and I am really appreciative of them coming down this evening. And my good friend Peter Patton, who's told me everything about the Fairhaven and Rutland Irish over the years. So again, it's great to have such wonderful friends who give me so many stories about the Irish. Stories that a non-Vermonter probably wouldn't come across, right? I came to Vermont, well, when I was 25, 26 years old, thinking that this was nothing but a Yankee state and I was going to feel totally out of it, having come from very Irish neighborhoods in San Francisco. But on the other hand, after a while, as I got to know people, I realized, God, there's a wealth of history about the Irish in Vermont that had rarely been tapped into, although we're seeing more work being done in the last few years. So I was happy to see John Duffy come in, who's done some of that recent work. Did a very nice article on a fellow who I will mention a little bit, Crean Brush, one of the bad Vermonters, right, John? Right? And also did a little article on the Irish Friends of Ethan Allen not too long ago, which was a fun article to read. Anyhow, for the past year or so, because of my interest in the Vermont Irish, I've been trying to gather as much information as I can, and hopefully in the next couple of years we'll have a book telling that story of how the Irish got to Vermont, what they found here, what they did here, and what happened to them. As I envision this book, I see it as being in, I don't know, 5 or 6 chapters. And I've done most of the research on the first 2 chapters. The first 2 chapters, which I thought initially were going to be 1 chapter. I thought I was going to have 1 chapter on the early Irish in Vermont, you know, talking about the Irish from about 1770 up to, but not including, the famine. Once I got into the research, though, it seemed to more naturally break down into 2 periods. So I'm going to tell you this evening about what I have found at this point dealing with those 2 periods. Looking into the future, where I think this research will be going, I see the period 1845 to 1860 as a unit built around the famine Irish coming into the state, what they encountered, how they got here, coupling that with, you know, kind of a mini industrial revolution that was taking place in the state. That is, the coming of all the railroads into Vermont. Then a 4th chapter would be a chapter dealing with the Civil War and the Fenian movement in the late 1860s and up to 1870. That may be a whole other unit. I say maybe because until you've done the research, you don't know exactly how things will fall out. And then later on, I'll get up to a period around 1880, 1890, which to me, and for anyone that is associated with the Burlington area, is an interesting period because the Irish really kind of take control of politics, right, with James Edmund Burke winning the mayoral race in 1903, subsequently winning it another 5 or 6 times. And really the Irish, and the French Canadians, and the Jewish community in Burlington really kind of take control of democratic Burlington. But that also happens in a number of other small cities. Rutland, for example, St. Albans, Montpelier, wherever there's kind of a large blue-collar Irish-French population, the Irish really kind of gain control. So it's, unlike what most of us have done in studying Irish American history, we look at New York City, Boston, the big cities where the Irish machines kind of take over. What we see here in Vermont are kind of these middling-sized cities, or smallish cities, where the Irish do fairly well in terms of politics. And then after that, there would be some kind of concluding chapter on the assimilation of the Irish, post-1920, and ultimately kind of almost the loss of identity, right? We become so Americanized, so assimilated that we're as Yankee as anyone else, I guess. Anyhow, let me also, before getting into the meat of this talk, say that, as I mentioned before, not a lot of work has been done on the Vermont Irish, right? We have a couple articles that John did. There was a man at St. Mike's in the early 60s. Pat, you probably remember, O'Byrne taught history there, right? He wrote a couple of very sketchy articles, but they were literally, I think, the first pieces ever published on the Vermont Irish, and he did those for Vermont Historical Society, their journal. Tom Bassett did a couple little pieces that were interesting. Jeff Potash, formerly of Trinity College, wrote a couple pieces dealing with the Irish up around Highgate. And there was a second one that I forget right now what Jeff did. Gene Sessions, formerly now retired, from Norwich, wrote a very good article, the only article on the Irish in one setting, and that was Northfield, right, one of the railroad centers of Vermont, and the railroad Irish that came in with the famine. Northfield became a strongly Irish town for the latter part of the 19th century, and Gene Sessions wrote that. And finally, I'll have to say, there was a fairly good master's thesis done by Brian Walsh, who teaches at Essex High School, the Essex Educational Center, on the Burlington Irish. He covers the period really from the early 1800s down to about 1900. There are some weak points in it, but Brian did a lot of work, a lot of census work for which we can be thankful, any of us working in the field. Then finally, what I'll say about this little talk on historiography, I hope everyone that's interested in Vermont history picks up the book that was done by Michael Sherman, Gene Sessions, and Jeff Potash, Freedom and Unity. I think it's a very, very good history of Vermont. It reads well. I do have a bone to pick with it, and I'm sure other historians will have a bone to pick, and that is there's not much said about the Irish. And I was really surprised with Gene Sessions and Jeff Potash being two of the writers, two of the contributors to it, because both of them had done work on the Irish. But other than that, my own little bias, it's an excellent work. Let me talk first about that early period that I mentioned, the Irish in Vermont, 1770 to 1815. The first thing I will say about them is there aren't many Irish here in that period, and there certainly aren't any patterns or trends in terms of the Irish being in Vermont, with the exception of one, but this was true of virtually all Vermonters at that time, and that was that everyone came here because land was available, right? We were, back in the 1770s, 1780s, we were the frontier, right? If you were living in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and you wanted to have a little bit better chance of acquiring some land, Vermont was a place that you would go to. Looking through old town histories, looking through census records, and so on, I come across sole Irishmen, kind of the lone Irishman in a town. For example, and certainly there are no trends, there are no patterns here, but just to give you the kinds of things that I would come across. There was a man living in Pownall in 1812 from Ireland. His name was Bernie or Barney. It's a little bit unclear when you read those census records, right? McMeacham. And apparently he had come to the United States in 1784 and finds his way to Pownall down in that southwest corner of the state. What's interesting was the source of this material. I didn't realize this, but during the War of 1812, the federal government, here's a trend, right, required all British aliens to register. And so 12 Vermonters, and I'm sure there were a lot of British aliens hiding in the hills, right, said, forget it, I'm not going to register. But 12 Vermonters registered, and one of them was this Barney McMeacham in Pownall from Ireland, but would be considered British at that time. There was a man by the name of Patrick Lynch living in Bennington from about 1800 to 1810, who had been a United Irishman back in the 1790s in Ireland, had spent time in jail. When his time was up, he decided, obviously, that Britain and Ireland were simply not the place for him, and so he emigrated, and he ended up in Bennington. Later on, he didn't stay. He married a Vermont woman, but he didn't stay here. He ended up going to Cuba. He was one of those wandering Irishmen, and he dies in Cuba trying to start a plantation of some type. There was a Daniel O'Brien I came across who was married in Bolton, just up the road, either in 1795 or 1796. Okay, Daniel O'Brien. And then there's my favorite, and this was a story I really wanted to mention. This was a young fellow by the name of Michael Madden, M-A-D-D-E-N, who was born in Cork, 1794, but at age 12, so roughly around 1806, apparently he's walking down the street. I don't know if it's in Cork City or Castletown Bear, but both of them would have been very important ports for the British Navy. He was shanghaied and impressed into the British Navy at age 12. He served on a British man-of-war, this of course during the Napoleonic Wars, but the ship puts in, or a ship that he's on, puts in at a Canadian port. We don't know, there's no mention of which port it is, and he jumps ship. This is after 3.5 years serving in the British Navy. So he's 15.5 years old. Somehow, Michael Madden makes it to Vermont, and he makes it down to Sherburne. I'm not even sure where Sherburne is. S-H-E-R-B-U-R-N-E, not Shelburne, but
Killington, Hampshire.
Down around Killington, that area? Okay. Anyhow, that's where he ends up. He marries there. He starts a farm. He farms there all his life. And Michael Madden, starting out as this shanghaied youngster off the streets of Cork or so on, dies in Sherburne in 1875. Now these are some of the the flotsam and jetsam, I guess Sean O'Casey would say, of the Irish who just kind of land on America's shores. There are three names that I guess one could say, for those of us who've done a lot of work in Irish history here in Vermont, John would know these names, I'm sure, and a few others, but some may not be familiar to you. One is John Kelly. John Kelly never lives in Vermont. He visited Vermont. He was a lawyer in New York City. Apparently had arrived in New York City about 1758, was pretty successsul. The few comments I've seen about John Kelly is that he was a shrewd businessman, a man of world affairs. I mean, he knew what he was about. He became interested in land speculation, which was about the only place at that time, we're talking 1760s, 1770s. If you had any excess money, right, you couldn't just plunk it down on Wall Street, and probably wouldn't anyhow these days, right? But you look to land. Land was the great engine for building wealth in colonial America. He also hooked up, it seems, with another Irishman, who John has done the work on. It's a fellow by the name of Crean Brush. Or it could be Crane, too. Not quite sure about that. Crean or Crane Brush, who came from an Anglo-Irish family, County Tyrone. you know, some means. He studied law in Dublin, came to America after his wife died, although he left a child to be raised by the family in Ireland. He comes to America, and I think it arrives around 1762, 62. He's already at least educated to the law. He passes the bar. He makes friends with people, you know, higher up in state government or provincial government, and begins, like John Kelly, investing in lands up in what is going to become Vermont, speculating in lands. Both Kelly, though, and Brush are speculating under New York grants. You know, that famous conflict about who controls that land, whether it's New Hampshire, who's also selling grants of land, or New York. They end up, both Kelly and Brush, owning quite a few acres in Vermont. Brush actually comes up here in 1770 and settles in Westminster, down there in that southeast corner on the Connecticut River, and is actually elected to the provincial assembly as the representative from what New York had delineated as Cumberland County, that area of what we know of as Vermont. John Kelly never, he comes up here, he visits Vermont from time to time, but he never resides here. When the Revolutionary War breaks out, Crean Brush becomes an avid Tory, and because he's a Tory, by the way, the Vermonters, particularly Ira Allen, the Vermont legislature passed a law simply confiscating all land owned by Tories. There goes all of Brush's land. I think most of Kelly's land, because Kelly's seen as sympathetic to the English. They lose their land. Brush offers his service to the English, who were at that point occupying Boston. Here the story to me gets very, very confused. Brush seems to be given the assignment of taking furniture out of homes of rebels because the British military wants to garrison their troops in these homes, and they don't want the furniture of these rebels to be harmed. It sounds like looting to me, that kind of thinly disguised looting. Brush gets on a boat to bring all these goods up to Nova Scotia. The ship is stopped by an American man of war. Brush is captured. He spends about 18 months or so in prison. He's trying to get his land back in Vermont. He's trying to get some kind of compensation from the British authorities for all this time he spent in jail. Nothing's going right for him. And as far as we know, the only account of what we have is what happens to Brush is that in 1777, I guess despondent over all these losses, he blows his brains out. Mr. Brush is gone. Although there's a side story to it that John was sure to tell, and I hope I won't mess it up. His stepdaughter, he'd married, again, his stepdaughter, right, John, is Frances Montresor. And if you know your Vermont history, right, Fanny Montresor is the one who marries Ethan Allen, Ethan Allen's second wife, right? Kind of interesting. She ends up with the arch traitor, right, from the British standpoint. John Kelly does not meet his end during the American Revolution, but things are tough for him ever after. He's fighting to get his land back. He's also made some bad loans. The only negative thing I ever saw written about John Kelly, and there's not much written about him, was from Ira Allen. You know? Ira Allen called Kelly something like the worst thief and scoundrel I've ever known. And of course, the real reason he said that is because Ira Allen, among all the people who he owed money to, he also owed a lot of money to John Kelly. So of course, John Kelly was a scoundrel. Of course, the big name in these early days in Vermont was Matthew Lyon. And he's probably the one person that I'm not going to say too much about tonight, because he's the one that most of us know most about. An Irishman who comes to this country, I don't know, when 1750s or so, comes from County Wicklow. We don't know too much about his background. That is, we don't really know about his religious background, although his latest biographer said he was probably born, raised an Episcopalian, that is Church of Ireland. Maybe not. The evidence isn't hard, I think, on what religious background he came from at all. Going back a minute too, I said we don't know anything about John Kelly's background. Crean Brush, as I said, was probably Anglican, Church of Ireland, just given his family background. Matthew Lyon comes here as a redemptioner. That is to say, once he gets off the boat, right, the captain has taken him on the boat, essentially free of passage, but once they reach dock, wherever it was, Boston or New York, then Lyon's services were sold to someone there on the dock who wanted to buy those services. In Lyon's case, it was a merchant from Litchfield County, Connecticut. But the difference between a redemptioner and an indentured service is a redemptioner could buy his way out. In other words, if somehow during the course of his servitude, let's say it was a 5-year term, if he got some money ahead and then went to his, quote, master, right, and said, you know, I'll give you so much money, will you release me from this contract? And if it worked out, then that redemptioner was free to go. I think for Matthew Lyon, going to Litchfield County was a turning point, the turning point in his life, because in Litchfield County, who does he hang out with? He's hanging out with Thomas Chittenden. He's hanging out with all the Allens. He's part of that group that comes out of Litchfield County that eventually comes up and establishes communities in the west side of what is going to become Vermont. He becomes part of that clique. He's a Green Mountain boy. He buys the proprietal rights to the township of Fairhaven, which becomes his kind of fiefdom. He does that in 1779. He's a rabid Jeffersonian Republican, which probably says something about his Irish background. I mean, he comes from that kind of rebel, no truck with the establishment, antagonistic towards any trappings of aristocracy. Thus, in the 1790s, when Adams is in power and the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans are feuding, he's a rabid Jeffersonian Republican. And of course, the people of Vermont, he's the Bernie Sanders of the 1790s, right? People of Vermont love him, right? He's elected to Congress representing Vermont, goes down there, gets himself in immediate trouble. He's got a terrible temper. He overhears a congressman from Connecticut named Griswold making some disparaging remarks about his courage. There'd been an incident during the Revolutionary War and where one could say his courage was in question. Lyon hears this remark, didn't like Griswold at all, goes over and spits in Griswold's face, right? Gets the name, the Spitting Lion, after that. A few days later, on the floor of the Congress, Griswold, who had a temper himself, comes over and starts beating Lyon over the head, right, with his cane, and the two have to be dragged apart. This is almost a high point in Lyon's career. Again, the people of Vermont love him. The Jeffersonian Republicans love him. He's kind of the great champion. The Federalists, right, vilify him every chance. And in fact, to kind of suppress his vehemence against the Federals, remember the Federals passed those Alien and Sedition Acts, and Matthew Lyon is convicted because of his writings against the Federalists under the Sedition Act, and he's put in jail. I think he's put in jail in Rutland, and the good people of Vermont elect him to Congress again while he's in jail, right, so his second term. That's pretty much the story of Matthew Lyon. His business, his community, his holdings in Fairhaven don't do well. At this time, he's forced to leave the state. He goes to Kentucky because I think Kentucky was one of the few places that didn't put debtors in prison. Goes to Kentucky. Actually, Ira Allen would follow him a few years later down to Kentucky before ending up in Philadelphia. He goes down there and he's elected to Congress from Kentucky. And a few years later, he is exploring the possibilities of what's going on in this new territory of Arkansas, and he's appointed, I don't think elected, the agent of the Arkansas Territory to Congress. So in a sense, he kind of represented three different areas of what was going to become the United States, and he dies around 1820 or so. Anyhow, an interesting character. I want to bring up, though, a fellow who I came across from this early period who I don't know what to do with, and maybe after my talk's over, you can give me some thoughts on it. Someone I thought was really interesting. As part of my research, every now and then I'll pick up a book in my library. You know how you'll just kind of thumb through it? And I happened to pick up this one book. It wasn't Doyle's political history. I forget what it was, but it was a book that said something about the convention that was held in Bennington, January 1791. This was the convention in which delegates from each town went down to Bennington to vote on whether we would accept the Constitution of the United States, and if we did, we were going to become the 14th state. In other words, this is kind of the ultimate convention to become part of the federal union, right? I'm looking down the list of the names of delegates. And there's Ephraim, and there's Ethan, there's what a great Yankee name, Caleb, and so on. And right smack dab in the middle of them is Michael Flynn. And I look at this now, Michael Flynn, he's representing Bethel. I said, yeah, this is odd. I mean, it's obviously an Irish name. Who's Michael Flynn? I've never heard anything about him. I did a lot of research on Michael Flynn. I even drove down to Bethel and sat down there in the town clerk's office going through the land records, the town records. I ended up looking at histories of Woodstock, Connecticut, the histories of Bethel, going through a lot of census reports. And here's what I found out, and you'll understand, I think, why this is a problem for me. What I know of Michael is this. His grandfather, Richard, was in, is it pronounced Billerica, Massachusetts? Billerica? Okay. Was in Billerica, Massachusetts, at least as early as 1723, because Richard Flynn, from Ireland, one of the early texts says that, from Ireland, is married. I don't know who. I don't know if he came from Ireland married or if he met a woman in Massachusetts and is married. But the wife has a son in 1723 in Billerica, Mass. Okay? The son is also named Richard. So we've got Richard Sr., Richard Jr. Sometime between 1723 and 1742, the Flynns moved to Woodstock, Connecticut, which I found kind of interesting, right? I would have thought that area would be more settled, that you'd be going the other way, but more towards the frontier, towards Vermont or western Massachusetts or somewhere. But they go down to Woodstock, Connecticut, which is in the east side of Connecticut. What's also interesting is another family goes down there at just about the same time, and this was the Manning family from Billerica, Massachusetts. Okay? And in the Manning family is a young girl, daughter, Sarah, who was born the same year as Richard Jr. Okay? Both the Manning families and the Flynn family settle in Woodstock, Connecticut. Then the next thing I learned is Richard Sr. and his wife are killed crossing the Charles River, the frozen Charles River, which obviously wasn't quite as frozen as they would have liked it to have been. So all of a sudden, the Irishman, Richard, he and his wife are dead, right? And I don't know when this happens. I don't know if this happens in 1728 or 1740, right? So I don't know who raises young Richard. Is he raised by his parents, or is he farmed out to another family? What's interesting is that in 1742, Richard Jr. marries Sarah Manning. That's interesting that the two families had both gone to this same place. Was there a relationship there? Did maybe Richard Sr. work for the Mannings? Whatever, right, down there. It's also interesting that Richard Jr. Marries Sarah in the Congregational Church in Woodstock. it's also interesting that Richard Jr. becomes one of the staunchest members of the Congregational Church there. So we don't know what Richard Sr.'s religious background was. You know, was he Scots Irish? It's possible. Was he Church of Ireland? Was he Quaker? Right? Was he Catholic? And in this new land with virtually no Catholic churches, that he simply, you know, to use a modern day phrase, right, go along to get along, right, to survive. And if you were going to get married, right, and there's no Catholic church, well, you know, you get married in the church that's there, right? Who knows the answer to all those questions? What is true is that Richard Jr. is a staunch Congregationalist, and then there's a controversy about in the 1750s between, you American historians will know this, this is all new to me, between the Saybrook platform Congregationalists and the Cambridge platform. It was really kind of a controversy over how churches should be organized or not organized. And anyhow, Richard Jr. is right there in the thick of things. Anyhow, they have a son, Michael. This is our man, Michael Flynn, about 1754. There's also another brother to John. Michael's got a brother, John. There are actually about 9 kids. Both Michael and John are blacksmiths, as was their father, Richard Jr., was a blacksmith. In fact, in the controversy in this Congregational church, the congregational community gives Richard Jr. the keys to the church and tell him, keep the other crowd out. And I suspect, you know, here's the guy who's the blacksmith in town. He's probably the biggest, toughest guy in town. And they're saying, you know, keep the other crowd out. Anyhow, Michael, the son, is a blacksmith. He goes off with his brother John in the Revolutionary War. They fight with a Connecticut unit during the Revolutionary War. But in 1779, a man in, well, the 2 boys come out of the service, whatever. There's a man in town in Woodstock named Ephraim Child, and he has invested in land in Bethel, Vermont, as are a lot of people from eastern Connecticut. You know, it's interesting how that western Connecticut crowd invested in western Vermont. The eastern Connecticut crowd and central Connecticut crowd, they're investing on lands going up the Connecticut River and the White River. It's that eastern Connecticut crowd, particularly around this Woodstock area, that are buying up these parcels, the townships along the lower Connecticut River and the White River. And anyhow, Child's 2 boys then get a couple of farms and go up to, that is, they get some land from the father and go up to Bethel. They settle there, and our man Michael Flynn kind of tags along with them and settles there. 2 years later, in 1784, Michael marries, what's her, oh, I've forgotten her first name, but he marries a Child. In other words, these families are all connected again. And Michael becomes kind of the leading figure in Bethel. He's elected town clerk. He's kind of everything in town. By the 1790, you know, the letters addressed to him are Squire. I mean, he's an important figure. It's not a big town, and we're probably talking, you know, 700-800 people. And thus, in 1791, he goes to that conference down in Bennington. Right, he is an important figure. Lives on there, dies about 1828, something like that. The question, and maybe again after this meeting, you know, some of you will share your thoughts with me. Is Michael Flynn Irish? To me, he's pure Yankee by this point. So it raises all kinds of questions about assimilation. And maybe we need to create a new term in colonial America, and that is kind of Yankee Irish. Because what we're finding is there are a lot of people like Michael Flynn that have already assimilated into American society. I think most of us who study Irish American history, we tend to, when we start to ask questions about assimilation, we're looking at the 1880s, 1890s. You know, here's a 3rd generation American, but from an Irish background. Now, that's the early period. And I'm going on way too much, and this is the period that I really want to talk more about, but I'll try to keep it brief. Right? Most of you know the quote that I'm going to begin with. This is, I'm starting now this second chapter, 1815 to 1845. The young Nathaniel Hawthorne, right, the writer of the Scarlet Letter, in his days before he has become famous as a writer, he would go out traveling around and write these little sketches of place that he had visited. In 1832 or so, he visited Burlington, just briefly. And he wrote I don't know, 1,500 word or so description of Burlington. It's a fun description to read. It's under the title, The Inland Port. But here's what he has to say. And again, I know some of you have heard this many times before, but for those of you who haven't, it's interesting. Okay, this is Nathaniel Hawthorne, writing probably this was published around 1835, but he visited Burlington about 1832. And he said, "Nothing struck me more in Burlington than the great number of Irish immigrants. They have filled the British provinces to the brim and still continue to ascend the St. Lawrence in infinite tribes, overflowing by every outlet into the States. At Burlington, they swarm in huts and mean dwellings near the lake, lounge about the wharves, and elbow the native citizens entirely out of competition in their own line. Every species of mere bodily labor is the prerogative of these Irish. Such is their multitude in comparison with any possible demand for their services, that it is difficult to conceive how a third part of them should earn even a daily glass of whiskey, which is doubtless their first necessary of life, daily bread being only the second." Well, you get two things out of it. You get the bias of Hawthorne and Yankee New England against the Irish. It goes on. There are more disparaging remarks. But you also get that impression that he has as he comes into the port of Burlington of all these Irish on the wharves. Now, something has happened. Right? Something has happened, right? In that first chapter, we've got just the Irishman here, the odd Irishman over there. Now, all of a sudden, we've got big numbers. And we're still 10, 15 years before the famine years of 1845, 1848. Well, let me give some explanations as to what had happened. First of all, there was a severe recession in Ireland following the Napoleonic Wars. Ireland did really well as long as those British armies and British navies were fighting on the continent and on the seas, because someone had to provision all those thousands of soldiers and seamen, right? Ireland was essentially kind of the garden for the British provisioning trade. Everyone was doing well. I mean, even the low person on the totem pole did well because, his labor was worth something. Right? But with the end of those wars, as often happens, right, recession, right, everybody's coming home, secondly, the fact that the potato crop of the 1840s was so great, so devastating, it kind of has overshadowed the fact that the potato crop, you couldn't count on it every year anyhow, and there were some bad harvests beginning in the 18 teens through the 20s and 30s. Okay, so there were some bad harvest. Thirdly, the British government was encouraging settlements, encouraging emigration to Canada, to British North America. And the way they encouraged it was by lessening the tariff on passenger tickets from the UK to Canada, as opposed to tickets on ships going from the UK to the American states. Right? So it was simply cheaper to go to Canada. Okay? Fourthly, there is a strong job market here in Vermont, right? I mean, think about it. That period, 1850 to 1820s, right? You have the building of the Champlain Canal starts, I don't know, around 1818 or so, right? You have the textile mills, right, in the 1830s, kind of exploding in the state of Vermont. The big mills that I certainly know something about in Winooski starts in the late 1830s and attracted Irish workers. Burlington was a boom town. I spent a fair amount of time reading through back issues in the 1820s of the Northern Sentinel, one of our local papers back in the 1820s, a Burlington paper. And I was really struck by how prosperous Burlington is. And people would write about how prosperous it was. There's construction everywhere, because once that canal opened, the Champlain Canal, 1823, right, Burlington became a key, basically international port. St. John's in the St. Lawrence River, you know, Burlington right in the midst of Lake Champlain, Whitehall in the Champlain Canal at the top of the lake, right? A lot of traffic going on, and Burlington's right in the middle of it. It just booms. There was plenty of work here in Burlington. And finally, I have to say, in terms of Vermont, getting to Vermont was relatively easy for an Irish person. Getting to northwestern Vermont was relatively easy. Okay? You came across the Atlantic, you came into a Canadian port, most probably Quebec City. That was the principal port. But you might have come into St. John's, New Brunswick. You might have gotten a ship that was going all the way down to Montreal, but probably not. You probably got into Quebec. And then from Montreal, you simply made your way down the St. Lawrence. You went over to St. John's on the St. Lawrence, St. Jean, right? And caught a boat there and came down to Burlington or to Plattsburgh or to Whitehall. Right? It was relatively easy. I've come across a couple descriptions of people coming to Vermont. One was an interesting, they were all interesting, but one I thought I'd relate to you. This was a couple and their children. Their name was Oliver and Mary O'Hara. Oliver and Mary O'Hara. Her maiden name was MacIver. She came from a Scots Presbyterian background. They're from Antrim, County Antrim. He, with a name like Oliver O'Hara, it's kind of hard to tell. O'Hara's there are two places in Ireland where there are a lot of O'Haras, County Sligo and County Antrim, right? So it's an old Gaelic name. Is this a mixed marriage? Is he Quaker? Does he have some Scots Presbyterian background? We don't know, but she comes from a Scots Presbyterian background, but she'd become a Methodist in Antrim. So she's a Methodist by the time they were married, which is in 1815. They're married in 1815. Apparently she had a brother who was living by 1830 or so in Derby, Vermont. One of the things I've found very interesting in whatever letters I've come across, you know, even in this early date, you know, when I'm 1820, 1830, there's someone that's always there in Vermont before. And of course, you always say, well, what's he doing there? How did that first guy get there? Well, sometimes we just don't know. In this case, Mary O'Hara's brother, Thomas, I think was his name, was living in Derby, Vermont. Okay. Well, the O'Haras were, as a later family historian said, who wrote this story down about 1880, said they were comfortably poor. They were not, you know, they were not destitute Irish. They were comfortably poor. But they did have, they had 7 or 8 children. Things were something of a struggle. And in about 1840, right, their oldest son, his name is Alexander, he says, I'm going out to America to be with Uncle Thomas. You know, he wants to make it in the world. He takes off. And a younger son, John, then apparently tells the parents that he wants to follow his brother and out to Uncle Thomas's. The family now, the whole family, they decide, gee, everyone's splitting up, they're taking off. Why don't we all just go to America? So in 1842, they've got a plot of land. I'm not sure if they own it or have a long leasehold on it, but they sell whatever interest they have in the land. Right? Oliver O'Hara gives his mother, who's still alive, 100 pounds. Guilt money? I don't know, but that's to take care of her in her old age back in Ireland. They go up to Belfast. The O'Hara family goes up to Belfast, where they think that they are going to be sailing on a clipper ship right? A fast passenger ship to America. It's a ship called the Independence, but they miss it. The Independence takes off, and the only ship that they can get is an old lumber scow. It had some kind of odd name. I can't remember. I mean, they're totally disappointed. It was described as the ship was big and clumsy and a wretched sailor. It took them 6 weeks to get across the Atlantic. They left at the end of May, and they arrived at Quebec City in mid-July. 6 weeks across the Atlantic on this old scow. They spend one night in Quebec City and then catch a steamship down to Montreal. And then they took, not exactly sure what this means, they took the cars to St. John. Stagecoach, some kind of cart, some kind of wheeled. Pardon?
What year?
1842, excuse me. Yeah, 1842, 3 years before.
There's a railroad from the Prairie to St. John.
Oh, really?
The
Oh.
cars would look like coaches
Yeah.
early on.
You know, I never even thought of that.
They weren't
It could
like
be
the
the
normal
railroad.
freight cars you see, they were more or less like coaches in the old days.
Oh, well, thank you.
I'm not sure it's that early, but it could be.
Well, I will check that out now, Chair. They get to St. John's. I think their money is depleted, or I guess just because of the geography, they want to go to Derby. And the only comment I have is that Mrs. O'Hara says that Oliver and her son, I think the oldest son, walked. You know, so meaning they might have been on some kind of vehicle at that point to get to Derby. Finally, they meet up with the uncle in Derby, and the family eventually settles in Holland, Vermont, and they're still part of this family. They're at the end of the 19th century. What happens after that, I don't know. There is also another wonderful story about crossing the Atlantic, and this is a story that I told Anne Rowley Harrigan that I was going to tell a story about who I thought was one of her ancestors, and she said, yes, it was. This is a story about a woman by the name of Elizabeth Flynn Rowley, R-O-W-L-E-Y, who's from County Leitrim, more to the west, northwest of Ireland, who has married back probably in the 1820s. She was born a Flynn. She marries a Rowley, also from County Leitrim. They have 6 children. Sometime around 1840 or so, they decide they are going to America. Of course, I'm not quite sure if they have enough money. So Elizabeth is sent ahead, right? The wife, the mother, is sent ahead alone, makes it to Vermont, right? She works here. She then writes back to the husband saying, here's the money, you and the 6 kids now can come over. He writes back and says, no, I'm afraid I won't cross the ocean without you. Of course, she's in Vermont, right? Elizabeth, right, gets on a boat, goes back to County Leitrim, collects the husband, and now because she's had to spend extra money, right, making her way back, there's only enough money for 4 of the kids. So this not too brave husband and his wife and 4 kids come back across the ocean to Vermont. They then earn some money and send money back to bring over the last 2. But I thought it was a great story about this very brave woman who's made 4 crossings across the Atlantic on, I'm sure, ships that were pretty rough to sail on around 1840. What became very clear to me after studying census records and knowing what little I knew beforehand from people, talking with people, is that in this period, the 1820s, 1830s, where the Irish were concentrated in Vermont, the early Irish that were coming in great numbers, was in 2 or 3 places. Number 1, we saw Burlington, right? Hawthorne tells us that. Number 2, though, is Franklin County, specifically the town of Fairfield, specifically the town of Fairfield. I'm going to give you, this are just some quick statistics. In 1830, okay, Burlington had a population of about 3,500. 1,800. Brian Walsh's estimate, which I think is high, he thought about 11% of the population was Irish surname. The only way you could check this in the census reports, there's no place of birth, just names. That's all you have, right? I went through that same census, and I don't think that's right. I think Brian's estimate was high. I think it was only about 3%, or excuse me, if you go through the surnames, it was only about 3% of the surnames were Irish. But I think that is low. The reason being is I know there were other Irish people in town by businesses that were in town. You know, if you look at Walton's Register and something, you can see these business names that are obviously Irish. I'm going to guess that probably 5% or so of the population of Burlington in 1830 was Irish. In 1840, though, my estimate going through is about 6.5% of Burlington's population is Irish surname, big increase. And a figure that is a very hard figure, that is that we know, and I'm jumping ahead of our story, is that in 1850, when the census reports actually start giving places of birth, right? In 1850, Burlington has about 7,500 people, population of 7,500. Born in Ireland, okay, this is a good hard figure, right? 1,660, or about 22% of Burlington's population was born in Ireland in 1850. If you look at the next generation that was born here in this country of these Irish parents, because you can track that right in the census, the total of Irish in Burlington is about 2,200, or about almost 30% of the population of Burlington in 1850 is Irish. Underhill, another very, very Irish area. Early on, in 1840, has a population of 1,441. Irish surnames are about 131 people for about 9% of the population of Underhill. Underhill's a very Irish area very early on. And I'm glad to see Jim Leddy here tonight because I have a letter that John Leddy gave me a copy of from one of their relatives. This is a letter from 1837 from a man by the name of Bernard Bruin, B-R-E-W-I-N. Sometimes also spelled B-R-U-I-N, and these names from the Gaelic to the Irish, and particularly if the Irish immigrant couldn't read or write, you know, he said, well, my name's Bruin. Well, you know, the immigration officer or whoever didn't know how to spell it, so they just put down whatever. I read this letter because it shows a trend that's going on, and that is there's a lot of networking. People in these Irish communities are writing home saying, you know, things are pretty good here, why don't you come out? You can buy land or so on. And here we actually have a letter, right, to this effect. This was written from Underhill, January the 18th, 1837. John Leddy thought that the original that he has might have been a copy that was made at some point. And the letter goes like this, you know, writing back to Ireland. Dear Father and Mother, I take the opportunity of writing these few lines hoping to find you in good health as we are in at present. Thank God for it. Dear Father, I was very sorry to hear that you were in a delicate state of health the last season. The letter you sent me in April, I did not receive it until December. Things were a little bit slow, right? I was working near Boston last summer and did not get home until December. I have been married on the 1st of December to Betsy Farrell, and we are settled down to housekeeping. I have paid all for my farm and got a deed forever for it. Isn't that amazing? Of course, and these are people that couldn't buy land in Ireland, right? These were people that were tenant farmers. So here's this son who can proudly say, I have a deed forever to this piece of land. It has taken all the money I could earn to pay for the farm, and provisions is very high this year. Past season was very cold, and we had a very early frost in September that killed everything. Corn is 9 shillings per bushel, and wheat is $2 per bushel, and potatoes is 2 shillings per bushel. Pork is from $8 to $9 per hundred. Beef is $5 per hundred. Da-da-da-da. Then he goes on to say, Dear Father, I would be very glad you would send Catherine to this country, for she would do well. Girls can get $2 per week where I was last summer, Boston. Right? It has taken all the money I could raise, grammar here is not too clear, I could raise from me to pay for my land and going to housekeeping this winter on. I would pay her passage, but if you could send her, it would be best for her and you. He doesn't have the money, right? If she comes, let her not go to any trouble about getting clothing. Let her get no cloak until she comes here. I think that Brother William would do well by coming here. I would encourage him to come, for he will do well if he works well. Let him bring some feather beds and linen with him. Okay, encouraging family members. And this is going on all the time, these letters going back and forth, whether through a regular postal service or by a relative like this woman, the Rowley woman, right, who goes back. I'm sure she was carrying letters to other relatives back there. Finally, I'm going to end, because I'm going on way too long, talking about the Fairfield community, because to me this is the most important community. Outside of Burlington, this is the most important early Irish community in Vermont. In 1840, I'll start with the statistics in, Fairfield has a population of about 2,448. Irish surname are about 283, or about 11.5% of Fairfield's population are Irish in 1840, right, 5 years before the famine. That figure is going to go up, but did I keep it? After the famine, in 1850, and again, these are much better figures because they're broken down by place of birth and so on. About 22% of Fairfield's population in 1850 were either born in Ireland or were the next generation, the children. They rarely, the early Irish, married outside their community. You know, you look at Mr. and Mrs., it was always within the community. The first settlers into this community came in sometime between 1815 and 1825. As close as I can tell, the first settlers were some brothers, the McEnany brothers, M-C capital E-N-A-N-Y, and also a family of Kirks, K-I-R-K-S, which apparently is the Anglicization of an Irish name, Q-U-I-R-K-E, pronounced Kirk. Both names are County Louth names, and both families came from County Louth, just north of Dublin. This is consistent with our literature on Irish immigration, that the province of Leinster, before the famine, was the province from which most Irish came to British North America. Louth would be a part of Leinster, the northern edge of it. Other families quickly followed in the 1820s: Carrolls, Flynns, Tierneys, Shanleys, Breens, Sheridans, and Ryans. Okay? You had a fair number of Irish there by 1830. But of the Irish that I've been able to identify place of origin in Ireland, right, there's an overwhelming preponderance of people from County Louth, County Cavan, Meath, and Westmeath. In other words, they're coming from the same area. Not all of them. There are some from Tipperary, from Kilkenny, and so on, but the great majority are coming from the same area. So you can see what's happening, right? Neighbor talking to neighbor, relative to relative. Why Fairfield, Vermont? You know, why does this one community have so many Irish? I think there are a number of reasons for it. One is it's very close to the Canadian border, right? Most Irish immigrants, right, that are coming into North America this time are coming in through Canada, right? Most of them want to come to the States, right? Vermont's very easy to get to for the reasons I just mentioned, and those towns right on the border, right? Fairfield, Swanton, Highgate, and so on. That's where the Irish are pouring across, who aren't taking the boat down to Burlington, or maybe even someone taking the boat down here, but if they want to farm, they hear about this Irish community up in Fairfield and go up there. I think that's one reason, simple geography. Now, number two, there's another reason which I've thought hard about. and I'll give you the little story that made me think about this. In 1827, Mrs. Patrick Deniver, one of those early families in there, gives birth to twins. She wants to have them baptized in the Catholic Church. Right? There's no priest. There's no Catholic Church in 1820. There's no Catholic Church in Vermont. Right? She and her sister carry the two twins up to Chambly, 50 miles away, have the infants baptized, and they walk the 50 miles back. In other words, I think one of the things that made that corner of Vermont attractive is it was close to the Catholic Church. Right? And this is a very Catholic community. These Irish that are coming in, definitely in the 1820s, 1830s, are all Catholics. Most of them. I can only find one Protestant Irish family, the Todd family, T-O-D-D, in Fairfield at this time. What was I going to say? I want to mention something about the Hourigans before I finish up on Fairfield. Now, the Hourigans were not pre-famine Irish in Vermont, right? Patrick Hourigan, the patriarch of the family, came over from Ireland. It was Clonmel, isn't it in County Tipperary, was it, Tom? Clonmel. About 1832, as close as 1834, somewhere in that neck of the woods. They came to Canada, and it's a large family. I forget how many kids. Well, they don't have a lot of kids when they get to Canada, but they stay in Canada about 12 years. And a number of the Hourigan children are born in Canada. But I suspect via the grapevine, they heard about this Irish community in Fairfield. Right? They probably heard that land was not too expensive. So in 1847, the Hourigans, who've been in the New World since the early 1830s, so in that sense they're pre-famine Irish, right, come down from Canada and settle in Fairfield, and many of their descendants still in Fairfield today. I'll make two comparisons too about the Burlington community and the Fairfield community. It's interesting that I don't think I have come across anyone in Burlington, the Burlington Irish, who can trace their ancestors back to being in Burlington in the 1820s, 1830s. I think the Burlington Irish were much more transient, right? I mean, they went later on with the railroad jobs, and maybe that's true of urban people in general. That's not been true of the Fairfield community, right? There are still many of the names that I've mentioned from the 1820s, 1830s, or 1840s that are still in the Fairfield area. And that probably says something more about a rural agricultural community and ties to the land. And in conclusion, what can I say about everything that I've said? I think the most important point that I can make about the early Irish in Vermont is that by the time of the famine, 1845, 46, 48, there was already a strong Irish presence in northwestern Vermont. Thus, it wouldn't be any surprise to us had we lived back in the late 1840s, 1850s, that when the famine Irish were flooding into the United States, that Vermont was going to be one of those places that they were going to come into. Many of them coming into Vermont via that Canadian corridor on the rivers, but also the new trend that we're going to see also coming up from the south, the ports of Boston and New York, as the railroads are being built coming into Vermont. So that will be my starting point for the next chapter and the next time I talk to you. Donna? Okay, questions? Should we take a few questions? Jerry?
Well, okay, you told us why Fairfield. Why Underhill?
Oh, that's the hardest question. I keep asking myself. I know a couple of the families immediately went into logging up there, but I haven't got a good answer for that.
There's an Irish settlement road in Underhill.
That's right.
And they're there really early.
But that's
20s, 30s?
That's right. They're there early. There's also kind of an odd Underhill-Shelburne connection. There are a few Irish in Shelburne. There's the O'Grady family that settled in Shelburne, right around 1800. They're there. And there's a family, I think they're Breens in Underhill by the 1830s, and some of the Breens come and work in Shelburne, and some of the Shelburne Irish kind of move back and forth. I can't quite figure out what that's all about yet, but I agree. Unlike Fairfield, which I think is easier to understand, I'm not quite sure what's going on in Underhill.
I might have a clue, and this is later, but I know of a family in the late 19th century whose patriarch is working in the ironworks over in Port Henry and comes to work in Shelburne. And I'm wondering, which is like, right across the lake, as I remember, the ironworks starts there over in Port Henry fairly early. Maybe that's some kind of connection there.
So someone from Underhill has gone to
No,
the
somebody comes down the lake to Port Henry
Yeah.
and then goes over to Shelburne to farm. He's a laborer over there in the ironworks. Farms over in Shelburne. That's got nothing to do with Underhill.
Yeah.
That may be where the Shelburne connection comes in.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you could be right, yeah, because all those ports are important. Plattsburgh's got a huge Irish community too. In fact, it's probably bigger than Burlington's in 1830. But going back to the Underhill, yeah, Underhill has me stumped. The only thing I can say about Underhill, maybe in addition to what I've already said, is that Fairfield seemed to be like the center of the wheel with these spokes going out. And you had Irish that kind of went out from Fairfield who were in all the surrounding towns. Bakersfield, Fletcher, Fairfax, right? Cambridge, okay? Now we're getting pretty close to Underhill. And some of the names are the same, but many aren't. But they could have been some kind of a feeder community or, community as an offshoot, but I don't know. Yeah.
Several questions, but one in the beginning was Mr. Flynn, that you mentioned. Is it a possibility that he is a deserter from the British Army or served with some army that was over here, possibly the British Army? Because sometimes when men appear, back in the old days, sometimes they're usually in a military service or brought over that way.
Yes.
It's a possible way to look at
it is possible because, but again, I don't know. It is possible because William Gilliland, Willsboro Bay across the lake.
Yeah.
He'd come over during the French. He was from County Armagh. He'd come over during the French and Indian War and simply stayed. And to bring it kind of closer to home, although in a little bit different way, during the War of 1812, where Burlington was the home, kind of the garrison of what was called the Northern Army, right? There were a number of individuals in that Northern Army who were Irish, and the reason I know that is because at least two of them were deserters, and there was a notice placed in the Burlington newspaper around 1814 or so, about look out for these Irishmen deserted from such and such unit. And I suspect, right, in our American Army, if we had Irishmen, the British Army in the War of 1812 and those naval ships on the lake probably had Irish who didn't go back when the war was over.
One more question. You'll see during the Irish famine, there are articles written, they have proven it, and there are records of the food produce and farm produce, and a lot of valuable food being shipped out of Ireland while the starvation is going on. One theory I've always thought of myself as a possibility is this country will need manpower, especially during the Mexican War, and then following this in the Civil War when the army will split in two and tear itself apart, so to speak. But could it be a correlation that people people in power were possibly creating immigration to fill the ranks later on down the line, that maybe they saw it coming?
I think that
it's
making the people of that too sophisticated to have thought that. I don't think so. Although a better case maybe could be made that in the Industrial Revolution we needed workers.
Right.
Maybe a case could be made, but those kind of grand conspiracy theories I don't buy into because they're just too complicated.
Well, would the Catholic priests back on, would they come and travel to the Irish communities?
Yes. Yes.
Probably,
that's right. I never got into Father O'Callahan, but yes, they would. And actually, the Catholic priest, Father O'Callahan, who was resident here in Burlington, 1830s, 1840s, would write back to Ireland, telling people to come over. There was a lot of kind of recruitment by the Catholic
Thank you very
priests.
much.
Somebody, John.
It's on the deserter question matter. The British military were posted, garrisoned in Canada up till 1870. The last detachment was taken out of Fort Lennox on the Richelieu River, 6 miles from the Vermont-New York border. Between 1815 and 1850, 5,000 British troops deserted to the United States, to the point where it became such a morale issue that the British authorities activated the Upper Richelieu cavalry, militia cavalry, who were on patrol for the last 10 years of that period at the border to capture deserters and take them back to post. It was a major morale issue, and it rose to its worst extent after the Canadian rebellions of the Patriots' War of 1837-38, when, perhaps in reaction to the very brutal suppression of that rebellion, the desertion rate spiked.
You can imagine, how many of them probably were Irish, right?
Well,
and since so many were recruited.
Could I give you a few points, things to add to some of the things you said tonight? John Kelly was not born in Ireland. His father was born in Ireland and came in the 1730s. His father was a cobbler. His father married into a family, Benson family, I think, into the same family that John Duane married into. John Duane came from Galway and was the father of James Duane, who was an attorney general of the province, and a very heavy speculator in New York lands. Kelly's son, the cobbler's son, was John Kelly, the lawyer. And despite what Ira said of him, he appeared before the Vermont legislature. He was back in good graces after the Revolution. And he appears before the Vermont legislature with a purse, a belt under his, the traveler's belt filled with 30,000 silver dollars, and he pays the legislature for 2 grants. One of them he calls Kellyvale. It's now part of the town of Fletcher, I think. Two grants up in that direction, was today northern Lamoille County. Those were his last pay. He pays hard cash for them.
30,000.
It's not paper.
So he was a worldly man.
Yes. And John Duane's son, James Duane, hires his cousin from Clonmel in 1760s to come after the 7 Years' War, after the French Navy, to come from Clonmel to work as a land agent in what is to become Vermont, and he settles on Lake Champlain. This is the father of William Duane, the great American radical newspaper man who fought so hard to get Thomas Jefferson elected, side by side with Matthew Lyon in the great election of 1800. And William Duane at first claimed that he was born in America. His mother took him back after the father died. He was raised in Clonmel. Eventually he makes his way to a tortured, growing career as a radical newspaper man, makes his way to Philadelphia in the 1790s, and takes over the newspaper that Benjamin Franklin's son-in-law had run, the Aurora. And he at first claimed that he was born in Clonmel, but when the Alien and Sedition Act came on, he begins to claim that he was born in Ireland, and he was born in today's Vermont. He has some interesting, he kind of manufactures his background, just as Matthew Lyon kind of manufactures some of his childhood. He claimed that his father was killed in the White Boys movement by, well, at least his Victorian biographers think, in the White Boys movement riots of the 1760s. But there were no white boys movement riots in Wicklow in the 1760s. Moreover, it is pretty clear that Lyon, the Lyon family was a Church of Ireland. One of his ancestors was probably the first Anglican bishop in Ireland, appointed by Queen Elizabeth. And in America, he always associated closely with Anglicans and, after the Revolution, Episcopalians. The Chittendens were very strong Episcopalians. At least one of Thomas Chittenden's son, Noah, was a pastor in Shelburne at one point. The Allens, Ethan's mother, petitioned for her tithing in Connecticut to go to the Episcopal Church when that was finally permitted by the Connecticut Assembly. You could select your tithing target. The Allens, until young Fanny goes to Montreal and is converted, when they were religious at all, they were Episcopalian. And Lyon goes to the conventions, the state conventions of the Episcopalian Church in Vermont in the 1780s and 90s, and he's a prominent figure in it.
It's a pretty strong evidence.
There's so it is not very likely that his father would have been killed by the white boys, because they were not landowners, they were not tithing agents, they were not dues collectors, fees collectors,
Well, they wouldn't have been.
But what a great story to tell when you're campaigning in Virginia and Kentucky for Thomas Jefferson among the Irish community. Roy Foster calls it making up an Irish childhood.
Someone else had one more question. Wait, maybe that was over here.
I just wondered if, with so many Irish coming through Canada, did you find any connection with families that half of them stayed in Quebec City or elsewhere in Canada and stayed in touch with the families that moved to Vermont?
I haven't come across that. I'm just trying to think. I haven't come across that. I mean, it would seem that if a whole family would, if they stayed in Quebec for a while, they would all come down here. I'm sure, though, that happened. It's just I haven't come across that. Okay?
Some of the Ryans didn't make it over the border, though. The Ryans in Quebec, it's very big, prominent family. Claude Ryan published the newspaper. The Ryan Dairy Farm in the town of Lyon borders Alberta, and they're a Franco family.
Yeah. Well, the last comment I'll make is I always got a kick out of that. My first time to Quebec City many years ago, I looked in the phone book, and there are more Feeneys in Quebec City than there are in Boston. Quebec City has a huge Irish population. Of course, they're all French speakers. Anyhow,
Thank you very much, Vince.
Donna, thank you.
What you said, that's very interesting.
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah, of course, it makes a lot of sense. People would just stop wherever they were.
Yeah. They ran out of money. They just, and because...